only 2 mainland Chinese, 2 North American Chinese, and 13 Indians. So we clearly are taking a lion's share of these as they come out. And this was a study done in Wharton, right, and across international business schools. Unlike Americans, why do Indians succeed? Because, especially when doing business in India, negotiating India's Byzantine bureaucracy is a key skill. And, you know, only Indians that live in the environment understand it, get it, and they know how to work with the red tape. This is a quote you'd like. You know, the difference between doing business in India versus in China. In China, they roll out the red carpet to invite new business in some ways. In India, Indians roll out the red tape. So we make it difficult for these businesses to do business in India, and consequently, in a way, it favors Indian CEOs who know how to get by and get through all of those red tape bureaucracies.
You know, all that red tape is very good for professional businesses in India, because the entry to the business is so difficult that only the experts trade. And that's why you got Birla, 20 companies.
That's right.
Reliance, 50 companies, and so on and so forth.
And
the
once
new
you've
blood
made it,
needs to come in.
Right. I do agree with that. And I think maybe, you know, the young entrepreneurial path, which exists so well here in this country, needs to exist and be supported by the government as well. So that you don't just have a few in that upper echelon living an amazing life. You have much more of them distributed. But I think this is a growing trend, and we're going to get there.
When you talk about China, folks, China is the most selfish country in the world. You know, I mean, you hear about piracy of DVDs and CDs and all the rest, and you need to understand why do they do so much of it. Now, here's a story that was, here's an opinion piece by Fareed Zakaria in Time magazine. He's finally come out and said that China is very parochial when it comes to the business within their country. They only want their countrymen to do it. China has 6,200 movie theaters. There's a strict quota of 20 foreign movies imported every year. That's
it?
all you can do.
Wow.
In the entire China, 6,200 movie theaters, because they only want you to see Chinese movies. Now, you would say that the most popular movie here, Harry Potter's newest one, and of course Transformers, Dark of the Moon, they don't have it there. But you know what? On the streets, you can have the pirated DVDs. You know, up here, when a theater takes on a movie, they pay 23% to 35% to the movie makers. In China, they said no, 13%, state law, federal law, 13%. And, you know, that's why the entire Hollywood industry much rather go to Bollywood than to go to China, because they can't seem to get anywhere with it.
Good. You know, why not? At least if there's an advantage here for the Indian film market, then good for India, right? I mean, because China has so many other advantages on its side in other ways.
Yes, and you know what? People say, well, why don't they complain to the World Trade Organization? Folks, they have complained. They have won. Doesn't care. China says, hey, we are now the most powerful country in the world. We'll do what we want.
Right, and they're not a democracy, which ultimately proves that sometimes business is easier to do in countries like India, because at the end of the day, it's still a democracy.
No, the bottom line is the American businesses and American politicians need to get wise. They should not just depend on this election money that they get from these foreign countries.
Right.
They should say, no, we can only import 10% to 15% of our goods from foreign countries. The rest are going to be made in the United States, and that's what should come through.
I do agree with you on that front. So I do agree that while China may be way too much on the nationalistic front, the fact is we could be doing more here to help ourselves, right, and not helping China with all of its stuff that it sends us that we want to buy.
But you know, Chinese are very smart. So they came out with this movie, The Revolution, you know, with Mao Zedong and everything else. They had famous actors in it. They spent $120 million making this movie. They put it in 3,000 theaters. They said, everybody watch it. Theaters are empty. No, but you're not going to see Harry Potter. You're going to sit in the empty theater and see the movie. In a heat like this, it'll be kind of nice to go see a good movie, but there you can only see Mao Zedong, you know.
Well, you know, you have to give China credit for trying to control this. I don't think they're ultimately going to succeed, but you know, it's an interesting phenomenon, the pirated CDs. Well, India will always forever be the land of modesty. You know, we talk about the sari, of course, being one form of that. And two interesting stories in the paper at the same time caught my eye on this subject. The first was in the Washington Post. We had done a story a few weeks ago, many of you might remember, about a movement that's really taken a global presence now. It started very small with women who decided they should be allowed to wear whatever they want without discrimination, and thus they started marching in the streets and parades started to happen, and they started calling these parades of women dressed in whatever they want, walking, banding together, as slut walks.
Yes.
Okay, so it was not the greatest title in the world, but the movement, in fact, is quite powerful. And it is sweeping across India as well, but in a slightly different form. Now, of course, India can't get behind this whole idea of the slut walk, so they have modified it some by taking the slut out of the walk, right?
No, only because it's political
Well,
that you have to keep yourself modest.
Well, I think it's actually in some ways a much more classier version of the slut walk, because these women are banding together, they're marching, they're walking, but they're doing it in their salwar kurtas, right, in semi-uniform fashion. Mm-hmm. And I think that's great. The men are walking with them. They're also wearing kurtas and sashes to match the women. So in a way, I think this has become a far more powerful movement. India has its own twist, but it makes you realize that we will always be a land of propriety
yes.
overseas, and Indians feel that way. So this was one story. The second story is even funnier. The LA Times did this. You know, folks, India has not really had cheerleaders much in its sports. You know, we're cricket fans
yes.
In India, but even cricket hasn't had cheerleaders, except for now. Cricket is changing. They're adopting a shorter format, something like the football games here, 3 hours, test match.